Chapter 9 of Ester Ried Yet Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried Yet Speaking by Pansy. Chapter 9. Tremendous Facts, he said. It is well that Mrs. Marion Dennis felt entirely safe in her friend Flossy's hands, for her affairs were very thoroughly talked over that evening, and sundry conclusions arrived at. One question Mrs. Roberts asked her husband, at the close of the conference, which apparently had nothing to do with Marion Dennis's affairs. "Evan, do you know Dr. Everett?" "Everett? Let me think. Yes, I know of him, a young physician, comparatively, who had not been here long, and has made his mark." "In what direction?" "Several, perhaps, but I have heard of him chiefly in the line of his profession. He was accidentally called to attend a young lady belonging to a very wealthy family out in Brookline. I say accidentally, that is a reverent way we have of speaking, you know. Of course, I mean providentially. The nursery governess in the family was sick, and this Dr. Everett, who had fallen in with her somewhere, volunteered to cure her. He was calling on her one morning when the sick daughter, who, by the way, had been given up by her physician, was taken suddenly and alarmingly worse. In the emergency Dr. Everett was summoned, and while they waited for the regular physician he succeeded in doing such a good service that he inspired the mother with confidence. She became anxious to put the case entirely into his hands, which was done, and the young lady recovered, and Dr. Everett's position, professionally, was assured. Isn't that an interesting little item for you? He is said to have marked success; and, of course, since the Brookline occurrence, his practice is largely among the wealthy. How has your attention been called to him?" "My protector this morning said that he was a 'swell' doctor, who was attending that Calkins boy. I wondered if he did it because he loved Christ. He might be a helper. I want to call on that sick boy to morrow if I can arrange it. I think I must take some one with me." "You may take me with you," her husband said emphatically. However much trips through alleys with Nimble Dick might be conducive to that young man's moral development, Mr. Roberts felt that his wife had experimented sufficiently. Thus it transpired that, dressed in the plainest, quietest garb which her wardrobe would furnish, Mrs. Roberts went to the alley the next morning accompanied by her husband. In one sense it was a mistake that the first call in the alley should have been made on the Calkins family. It was calculated to give Mrs. Roberts mistaken ideas as to the manner in which poor people lived. A bare enough room, certainly, not even a bit of carpet laid before the bed, but it was a clean room. Floor and window and cupboard door were as clean as water could make them, and the bed, while it looked hopelessly hard and dreadful to Mrs. Roberts, was really a pattern of neatness and purity to every dweller in that attic. There was a straw tick, covered with a dark calico spread, which did duty as a sheet, and the boy who lay on it was covered by a patched quilt that had been mended, and was clean. Wonderful things these to say of such a locality! Mr. Roberts suspected it, and Dr. Everett knew it. That gentleman was bending over his patient when the two guests arrived, and vouchsafed them not even a glance, while the dark-haired, dark-eyed, homely, decently dressed girl gave Mrs. Roberts a seat on the one chair which the room contained, and set a stool for her husband that had been made of 4 old chair legs and a square board. Sallie Calkins was somewhat flurried by this unexpected call. She had no idea who the people were, nor for what they had come. A vague fear that they might be in some way connected with her brother's place at the printing office, which he was in such fear of losing that his night had been a restless one, made her hasten to say, in a tremulous voice: "The doctor thinks he will be well in a little while. It isn't a bad break, he says, and Mark wants to keep his place. He thinks, maybe, some of the alley boys would keep it for him, if you would be so kind." She was evidently addressing Mr. Roberts, but she looked at Flossy. The fair, sweet face, that gave her such sympathetic glances, seemed the one to appeal to. Mr. Roberts, however, discerned that he was mistaken for the employer, and immediately dispelled the idea by asking where the boy worked, and how the accident had happened. "It was the elevator, sir," she said eagerly. "The chain broke, and it went down with a bang, and Mark was on it, and he rolled off somehow, he doesn't know how. And he has been that bad that he couldn't tell me if he had. He was kind of wild, sir, all night, and talking about his place." "Was there no one but you to be with him during the night?" Mrs. Roberts asked. "Where is the mother?" "We've got no mother, ma'am. There is only Mark and me, and father," she added after a doubtful pause. "But father was not home last night. Oh, I didn't need no one to take care of Mark. I wouldn't have left him." "And he likes to have you take care of him, I am sure. What do you give him to eat? He will need nourishing food, I think. Beef teas and broths, and nice little tempting dishes, made with milk, perhaps. Are you his cook, too? I wonder if you wouldn't like to have me show you how to make good things for him? I've learned how to make some nice dishes that sick people like." Before the bewildered girl could answer, the doctor turned abruptly from his long examination of the patient, and gave the guests the first attention he had vouchsafed them. The truth was, this man had had some unfortunate experiences with district visitors, and had perhaps an unreasonable prejudice against them as a class. "I can't help it, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Saunders, when she was taking him to task one day. "There are exceptions, of course, at least we will hope there are, but if you had seen some of my specimens, you would be the first to wish an infusion of common sense would be introduced among them. As a rule, they offer a tract where they should give a loaf of bread or a bowl of broth, and wedge their advice and reproofs in with every helpful movement. It is like so many doses of medicine to the patient, to be endured because he is at their mercy and can't help himself. They mean well, the most of them, but the trouble is, we have a way of making district visitors out of people who have nothing to do, and who have never learned that all the nations of the earth were made of one blood." Something in Mrs. Roberts' tones or words seemed to interest him, and he turned toward her. "Does this alley belong to you?" he asked abruptly, his mind still full of the district visitor. She regarded him with a puzzled air for a moment, then answered naively, "I don't think it does. If it did, I would have some things ever so different." Dr. Everett laughed, and Mr. Roberts came forward and introduced himself. "My wife has hardly answered you fully," he said. "I am under the impression that she desires to adopt a certain portion of this alley. At least I have heard of little else since last Sabbath afternoon. She is in search of some stray sheep who have been put under her care." "Ah," the doctor said, turning quickly to her, "a Sabbath school teacher? Is this young man one of your scholars?" "No," she explained, but she had heard of him while inquiring where one of her boys lived, and she had called to see if she could help in any way. Dirk Colson was the boy who, they told her, lived near this place. The eyes of the trim sister brightened. "He lives on the next square," she said. "Oh, ma'am, are you his teacher, and do you care for him? I'm so glad." "He is a favorite of yours, is he?" the doctor asked, looking from one speaking face to another, and seeming immensely interested in the matter. "No, indeed," the girl said quickly. "He's horrid. But I'm sorry for his sister. And she wants Dirk to get on, and he never does get on. But I thought maybe such a kind of a teacher could help him." There was such intense and genuine admiration in the girl's voice for the vision of loveliness before her, that Dr. Everett could not help smiling. "It doesn't seem unlikely," said he, with significance, and added, "Who is this Dirk Colson, who seems to be an object of interest?" "He is one of the worst boys in the alley, sir. Sometimes I think he is the very worst, because he is cross as well as hateful. But Mark is always kind of sorry for him, and says he has such a bad father he can't help it. And Mart, that's his sister, she is a friend of mine, and she feels bad about Dirk, but she can't do nothing. He ain't a bit like Mark there." The last words were spoken tenderly, and the sisterly eyes turned toward the boy on the bed, and obeying a sign from his eyes, she went over to him. The doctor plied his questions. "Have you recently taken a class, madame? And is their general reputation as encouraging as this special scamp of whom we are hearing?" His words almost jarred on Mrs. Roberts. She had already prayed enough for her boys to have a sort of tender feeling for them, a half desire to cover their faults from the gaze of the indifferent world. Did Dr. Everett represent the indifferent world, or did he love her master? She wished she knew. "There is nothing encouraging about them," she said, with grave earnestness, "save the facts that they are made in the image of God, and that he wants them to turn from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins, and an inheritance among them which are sanctified." A rare flash of intelligence and appreciation greeted her now from those fine eyes bent so scrutinizingly on her. "Tremendous facts," he said. "Glorious possibilities! Himself hath said it. I claim kinship with you. I am an heir of the same inheritance." He held a hand to each, and they were cordially grasped. Then Dr. Everett proceeded to business. "There is enough to do," he said. "Everything is lacking here. There is severe poverty, united to the most scrupulous tenderness and the most tender love on the part of this brother and sister. I stumbled on the case, and will do professionally all that is needed. And I have a friend who would undoubtedly come to the rescue, but she is crowded just now. I shall be rejoiced to report to her a helper. Do you know Joy Saunders? Well, I wish you did. She is one whom you could appreciate. She is young, though, and without a husband to guard her, and there are some places to which she cannot come." "Has she learned that important fact?" asked Mr. Roberts, with a significant smile. Then some explanation seemed necessary. "This lady," he said, "tried the alley alone yesterday, and lost her way, and went lower down, quite near to Burke Street, I imagine." "And what happened?" The quick question and the doctor's tone suggested possibilities not pleasant. "Oh, she met one of her new recruits, as hard a boy, so one of the policemen on this beat tells me, as there is in the row, and pressed him into service to escort her back to civilization, and strange to say, the fellow did it without placing any tricks." The doctor turned on the small lady a curious glance. "I think you may be able to do something even for Dirk Colson," he said. "Do you know him?" He laughed over the eagerness of the question. "Never heard of him before. I was only thinking of our friend's description of his awfulness. Ah, whom have we here?" For the door had opened abruptly, and a pair of great blue eyes, set in a frame of tawny hair all in a frizzle, had peered in on them. The vision was clothed in garments so torn the wonder was that they stayed on at all, and there was a general look of abject poverty about her to which Sallie Calkins, with all the bareness of her lot, was a stranger. She stood for just a moment as if transfixed by astonishment at the unwonted sight in the room, then turned and sped away as swiftly and silently as she had come. "That is Dirk's sister," Sallie Calkins said, coming forward, her homely face aglow with shame. "She isn't a bad girl, ma'am, she doesn't mean to be, but she has a dreadful time. Her mother is sickly, and has to go out washing, times when she isn't able to sit up, and there'll be days when she can't hold up her head. And the father is bad, ma'am, and drinks, and swears, and sells things for drink till there ain't nothing left to sell. And Mart hasn't anything to mend her clothes with, and she doesn't know how anyway. And she hasn't even got a comb to comb her hair with, her father took it to sell. And everything there is horrid, and Dirk, he's awful." It was strange, she could not herself account for it, but with every added word of misery that set poor Dirk Colson lower and lower in the scale of humanity, there seemed to come into this woman's heart, and shine in her face, an assurance that he was to be a chosen vessel unto God. The doctor was watching her again, curious, apparently, to see how this pitiful appeal for forbearance in judging of poor Mart affected her, and something in his face made her say, speaking low, "An inheritance among them which are sanctified." "Amen," he said, and there came to Mrs. Roberts a feeling that this earnest prayer, for the second time repeated by two men who prayed, was a sort of seal from the Master. She turned away from both gentlemen then. The tears were very near the surface. She must do something to tone down the beating of her heart. Sallie was at hand, and she went with her to another corner of the room, and a low-toned conversation was carried on, scraps of which floated back to the gentlemen in the form of sheets, grape jelly, mutton broth, a soft pillow, and the like. "I feel my patient growing better," the doctor said with satisfaction. "Is there no father here?" Mr. Roberts asked. The doctor shook his head, but answered: "There is the most pitiful apology for a father that I ever saw, a mere wreck of a man. Spends his time in a sort of weak drinking, if I may coin a phrase to describe him. He actually uses no energy even in that business. Just staggers around and bemoans his lot, a most unfortunate man in his own estimation, with whom the world, through no fault of his, has gone wrong. He is never downright intoxicated, and never free from the effects of liquor. He is much like a wilted leaf in the hands of this boy and girl. They could pitch him out of the window without much difficulty, and if the fall did not kill him, he would shed tears and say it was a hard world. But now what do we see, when the name of father is so dishonored, made a wreck as it were? Why, the order of nature is reversed, and these children take on the protective. They are father and mother, and he is the weak, sinning child. The way that boy and girl have worked to keep their miserable father from starving or freezing is something to astonish the very angels. They shield him, too. Nobody who wants to reach their hearts must blame him. They are a study. As different from the other inhabitants of the alley as the sky is different from that mud hole down there. It isn't a good simile, either. There is no religion in their efforts. They are the veriest heathen. How do you account for the development? The doctor shook his head. I don't account for it. It is abnormal. There must have been a mother who left her impress. I can't learn anything about the mother. She died when the girl was an infant. But I would like to know her history. I venture to assert that she belonged to Christ, and that a gleam of the divine pity that she saw in him and loved left its impress on her children. That is somewhat mystical, he said, smiling. I rarely talk in this way. It must have been your wife who set me off. But she is the most practical and energetic of beings. Aye, so are the angels, I fancy, and make us think of heaven directly we hear the rustle of their wings. Has your wife been a Christian long? Barely 2 years since she began to think of these things. I thought as much. She impresses me as one who is being led, who does not choose to go alone, has not learned how, indeed. A very few Christians never learn how, and with them the Lord does his special work. Well, sir, I must go. I'm glad to have met you, and glad to leave you here. Good morning. End of chapter 9. Recording by Trisha G.